Well, I'll be a son of a bitch. Delmar's been saved.
Well, that's it, boys. I've been redeemed. The preacher done washed away all my sins and transgressions. It's a straight and narrow from here on out, and heaven everlasting's my reward.
Delmer, what are you talking about? We got bigger fish to fry.
The preacher said all my sins is washed away, including that Piggly Wiggly I knocked over in Yazoo.
I thought you said you was innocent of those charges.
Well, I was lying. And the preacher said that sin's been washed away, too. Neither God nor man's got nothing on me now. Come on in, boys. The water is fine.
Howdy, Theologian.
Howdy.
I love that movie.
Oh, Brother, Where Art Thou? Oh, Brother, Where Art Thou?
Yeah.
Yeah, I do too. It's really clever.
It's very clever. The soundtrack's awesome. George Clooney's one of my favorite actors.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Ocean's 11.
Okay. I think he's very good in this movie. In Oh, Brother, Where Art Thou? And the soundtrack is so good.
You're not a George Clooney fan?
He's fine.
He's fine.
Yeah.
I don't know.
He's not the draw for me.
Really? He's so good looking and, you know.
All those things
George
can be
Clooney.
true.
In ER? Did you watch ER?
No.
You didn't watch ER? Oh
No.
my gosh. That's probably why I don't like going to the doctor. Watched that show too young as a child.
I watched, what's that other doctor show? Grey's Anatomy. That's what I watched. So when I go to the doctor, I always want to know, like, who's sleeping with whom and what's the drama.
What's the drums, Doc?
Behind all the closed doors.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, no. Oh, Brother, Where Art Thou was awesome. Dexter was telling us that it like flopped when it first came out, and then the soundtrack won a bunch of awards, and then they re-released it, and it like blew up.
Well, because the soundtrack's amazing.
It is.
That makes sense to me.
Cash and I, there's like a phase where Cash was probably 18 months, maybe 2, where he just wanted to listen to Candy Mountain over and over again. Which is a great folk song. So
Yeah. Yeah.
I should get that
It is a good
soundtrack
folk
on
song.
vinyl.
Oh, that's a great idea. Maybe I should do that for Neil.
No, I need to get that for Neil.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah, I'll do it for his birthday.
Well, I think that makes a lot of sense since Neil, my husband, that's who we're talking about right now, loves vinyl. That's like his love language. And we have so much vinyl. But what's one more? Especially if it's as good as the soundtrack.
I feel kind of responsible for that. I'm sorry.
I mean, don't take that much credit out for yourself, but sure, you can make amends to me some other way, I suppose.
Get you a new coffee mug.
Oh, thank you.
All right, we're talking about grace today.
Yeah. Speaking of making amends,
Yeah.
making things right.
Making things right.
Yeah.
Lining things up and
Ooh.
putting them in their proper place.
What a smooth transition we just made.
It's like we're professionals. Yeah.
Yeah.
Grace Part 2, 3-part series on grace, because Wesley
Yeah.
understood grace in a very unique way.
Yes. Yes. Grace overall is grace. It's the whole thing. And so what's the definition that we chose for grace?
God's unmerited favor, love, or help.
Yes. So we kind of emphasized the unearned, unmerited, undeserved loving action of God in our lives. That's kind of that working definition we gave it last episode.
Right?
So that's grace overall. And that's grace. I mean, grace is grace. But the way that we experience God's grace, I think, is what Wesley really emphasized for us, and how we could then recognize God's grace in our lives in these different ways. So it's not that grace is different or
Correct.
changes.
Yes.
It's that we recognize and experience grace in different ways.
Yeah, and last episode we talked about prevenient grace, and this idea that you really can't fully understand it unless you're looking backwards, right? Because it's active in your life while you're unaware of it. So it's
Yes.
God at work in your life before you're aware of who God is and your need for grace in your life.
Yes.
Then there's a moment where we become aware and we recognize that we are in need of God's grace. That's justifying grace. And then the sort of movement or the work of God's grace in our lives to help us better understand our role in the world, to live out our faith, to become more Christ-like. That's sort of the sanctifying grace, or grace that continues to propel us forward. But I like what you said. It's not like there are three types of grace. There's grace at work in our lives in different ways, but the grace itself remains the same.
Right.
It's God's movement towards us, and it's God's ability to like help mold and shift us. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's really important because when we talk about grace, sometimes it can seem like it's just this blanket like statement that just covers everything. Well, grace abounds, you know, and that's true.
That's true.
Right. But I think it's really helpful when we start to understand our experience of grace as humans, because then that helps us to identify God's grace in our lives more specifically, which then helps us respond to it,
Yeah.
which then helps us to grow in it. And as you said, that's the practice of sanctification.
Right.
Not that grace, and we'll talk about this, I guess, next week, but it's not that grace changes or there's more grace to be had, but it's our awareness of it and experience of it can change. And that helps us then to see it and recognize it and then be more open to it.
Yeah. No, that's a great way to say that, because it meets us where we are, wherever we are, and helps us to like take whatever that next step is. And sometimes we are aware of it, sometimes we're not. And that's why I think it's so important to do all this work within a community, because God's grace is active in our life all the time. And there's moments where we're really, aware of that. And today we're going to talk about that. But there are also moments where we're not, and we need others to sort of point us to it or help us see God's grace at work, or to have an experience or experiences of God's grace that help shift or frame who we are in relationship to one another and God. But I would say justifying grace, sort of the theme of the day, is probably the most recognizable form of grace. It's certainly the most popular.
Yeah.
In terms of like having growing up in the Bible Belt, it was all about this, right? It was all about this moment of justification where we are saved from our sins. And so, justifying grace is probably what most of us grew up thinking about in terms of God's grace having some sort of outcome or impact in our life. We're no longer going to hell, we're going to heaven, right? And it's because we are justified, we are made right.
Right. Yeah. It certainly is the one that was most closely linked. It was and is the one that's most closely linked within the Christian tradition to salvation itself, for sure. So let's look at the word justifying, since we're talking about this word.
It's a verb.
It's a verb. Yes. Accurate.
Okay.
And
good.
the standard definition, there are several definitions, but I love them all. So to prove or show to be just, right, or reasonable. The second is to judge, regard, or treat as righteous and worthy of salvation. So kind of the archaic, certainly Christian way of thinking about that definition would be to absolve somebody of a sin, for example. But then the third way, and I love this because it reminds us that we use this word actually a lot in our vernacular, and that is to space lines of text so that the lines come out as even at the margins, right? And you think about, we do that a lot. We talk about, especially in like design or formatting, we talk about, is this justified, right justified, left justified? And it's about making sure that the end of the line of text is all lined up.
Right.
Yeah. And so there is something about like lining something up, making it right, making it in line where it should be all together.
And I think, so there's left justified, right justified, centered or center aligned. And then there's just justified.
Yeah.
Which is like everything is evenly spaced accurately to both margins and the header and the footer. Like it's like a perfect rectangle.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's just about justifying grace, and can be looked at as this opportunity where we are aligned, perfect alignment with who God is, and God sees us in that right alignment.
Yeah. And so I think we identified that moment of alignment, as you said, with salvation itself.
Yeah.
Which that's not how Wesleyans from in the United Methodist, certainly tradition, view salvation. But it is how so many Christians view it, for sure.
Yeah. What's the distinction there then? What's unique about how Wesleyans view salvation?
Well, I think to start with that, we have to start with how a lot of the other Christian traditions view salvation. And regardless of if you're Catholic or Protestant, there is a sense of salvation being a momentary experience where you do something like confess, pray, receive communion, or you say a prayer, or you get baptized, or
the sinner's prayer, right?
Right, the sinner's prayer, right? Yep. But you get baptized, and therefore in that moment you experience salvation and you are saved. I think Wesley acknowledged that we experience these moments of justification, moments where we recognize and realize that we are made right with God. And Wesley believed that we can actually grow in grace, and therefore salvation is more of a experience of a journey than it is a momentary destination.
No doubt.
Because we can either always be moving towards God or away from God. And so if you look at kind of standard doctrine, like Christian doctrine, one of the big differences between the Methodist movement and the like Calvinist theology is that, they believe that once saved, always saved. And we would, as United Methodist, would say, oh, no, you can experience salvation and then choose and then be growing in that, or you can turn away and you can reject that.
There's a different emphasis, right? So Reformed theology is going to say, once saved, always saved, because you don't really play a part in your salvation. Where Wesley's going to say, no, you can be saved and then lose your salvation because there's a high emphasis on free will.
And you can reject, essentially.
You can reject God's gift. Because if you can't reject God's gift, then how is God all loving, right? And how do we then live in a relationship if we're coerced into it, right? So the notion of free will is really important for us. But it does highlight this idea that we're on a spectrum, or we're on a journey. I love the analogy of a journey. Salvation is a journey. But at some point, if we think of it as a hiking trail, right, we can stop, turn around, walk back to the trailhead. And I think that is really important for us as Wesleyans to proclaim, because it is it's the nourishment we need in our faith journey to know that, like, we don't know where we're ultimately going to end up on that path, but we do believe that God's grace is sort of propelling us up that path. That's why it's important to journey together and to be aware of when we need help continuing on that path instead of, retreating back. And God's grace then is active in that whole process. right? That's what we've been talking about, is that we experience God's grace differently, but God's grace doesn't change, and it sort of pushes us on that path. And it's really around baptism that we see this sort of, that's the part I think that's so hard for me to let go of as a kid growing up in the Bible Belt in the South. Like, it was all about that moment of being saved. And it was always, for my friends who weren't Methodist, it was the majority of them, it was all about professing Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, getting baptized, and being saved. And that was the end game. And so there was this moment where they understood God's grace as only active when you made that choice. Everything else before that is really you struggling to understand who you are. But the moment you sort of profess Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, everything changes. You are saved, you are baptized, and you're done. Right? There's not much left to do.
Yeah, but like, don't they rebaptize?
Some do, yes.
Yeah.
Which is the interesting thing, because
Right.
they don't believe, there's a big movement within sort of Baptist theology that would say, once saved, always saved.
Right.
So they would rebaptize, but they would say the first time wasn't really your moment of salvation. So they're connecting action to salvation. So you only really know if you're saved is if you're like become a good person after your baptism, right? You stop sinning as much.
Yeah. As much.
As much, right? I mean,
you're totally depraved.
Because that's how they would get folks to be rebaptized all the time. It'd be like, well,
The first one
you had,
must not have took.
yeah, you were drinking alcohol underage, or you were, you got caught in the backseat of the car with that, girl or whatever. Like, then you'd freak out, and then you'd be like, I need to be saved. Then get rebaptized, and then maybe this time it'll take. And I think that's it doesn't compute with how I grew up, right? As a sort of, in the United Methodist Church, we do not rebaptize at all.
And we baptize bebés.
We baptize little babies and
Little
adults.
babies. And adults.
But
yeah.
we baptized, we baptized babies, and it's like my favorite thing to do.
Yeah.
And justifying grace is active in that space, but just not for that baby, right?
Yeah, we talked about infant baptism when we talked about prevenient grace.
Right.
But this is really important to recognize the work of justifying grace. And, I get it. I get the emphasis on justifying grace being kind of this moment of salvation. I get that, because justifying grace is often, that's what we experience so strongly, because ultimately it's that moment where we realize that we suck, that we've really messed up, that we not suck as in like human nature at our core.
I was just making sure.
Yeah.
You're wearing a shirt that says already good on it.
I know. I am already good.
So it's not a nature, but we've made a mistake.
Yeah.
Maybe it's significant. Maybe we're unaware of it.
But it's like that moment where you just realize like how much you need forgiveness. I mean, and I talked about this when we talked about sin and being a sinner.
Agreed.
And, and I was thinking about, because I referenced that kind of, it's very Catholic, but that prayer that I say, Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And there's something like relief when you acknowledge that you've made mistakes and that that's okay.
Right.
So I think justification in that moment is so powerful, because it is a realization of how much we need grace. And it's also then a realization that grace is already there for us.
Yeah.
Like it's like that moment of both. It's like both we need it and we already have it.
Yeah.
And that's actually why I wore my shirt today, because it's
I like the shirt.
Yeah. It's that powerful kind of experience of the way I think about it. And maybe I've shared this with some folks before, but it's like when you need chapstick, but then you like have chapstick to put on your lips. So it's like that moment of, oh my gosh, my lips are so dry. I need relief. But then it's like getting relief right away, and how amazing that feels.
Right. I'm like thinking about chapstick.
I know. I could use some right now.
So we believe that, so justifying grace, we believe is present in baptism, even when we're baptizing babies, but it's not for the baby.
Exactly.
Because we have to be aware of
Yes.
it, right? I
Yeah.
mean, justifying grace comes about when there's this mutuality between our recognizing we need it and God sort of offering it as a gift. And it's a kind of collision of those two things. But the congregation becomes aware of it when we baptize babies.
And
right?
the parents or the sponsors of the person.
Yeah, because they're making
they're the ones making a
profession of
statement of faith. Yeah, they're recognizing their sin. They're recognizing that they're forgiven for sin. So that's a moment of justification that happens in baptism, no matter the age of the baptizee, because what we are kind of recognizing in that moment is baptism isn't just about the individual and God.
Right.
Baptism is about the individual and the community and God. Again, we talked about this last time, but that means that the grace experienced in baptism isn't just grace for that individual.
Yeah.
It's grace that everyone gets to participate in. And because everybody is at different kind of stages in terms of their relationship to the individual and different awareness levels, then it's different. They experience the same grace in different ways. So the baby or the individual who is not aware, they receive grace in a prevenient way. So grace is present for them fully, and they don't have to be aware of it. It requires nothing of them. And that's the power for us of baptism, is that presence of grace in that way for them. But then the sponsors or the parents in the community confess their sin and they recognize forgiveness of sin. And they commit their lives to growing in grace. Mm-hmm. And that is, because of that awareness in that moment for them, that's justifying grace. And then we'll talk about sanctifying grace next. But so it's powerful to think about God's grace is grace and present for everyone involved. But because of our awareness, it's present in different ways.
Yeah.
For each one of us. And so for Methodists, the power of baptism is God's grace. And it doesn't require the baptizee in and of themselves to have a justifying moment. Now, we believe that we will all experience justifying grace.
Right.
And we, as Methodists, certainly believe we'll experience it multiple times. Every time I say that prayer, I'm like, oh yeah. And let's talk about communion. That's a means of grace. And that's a way for us to experience justifying grace on the reg. Because as we take communion regularly, whatever schedule that looks like in our faith community, but as we
I thought it's always once a month. What? Are there churches that aren't doing it once a month?
Are you joking? Yeah. And some churches do it every week. How about that?
Love it.
Yeah. But for them, it's like every time they take communion, it's that reconnection, that confession of sin, that nourishment, and, all we experience grace in all ways there as well.
Yeah. And it's also why we have an open table.
Yep.
Because who are we to prohibit someone's experience of God's grace, especially around that justification, that moment of justification.
Yeah.
We don't require people to already have had that experience to be worthy of coming forward to receive God's grace.
Exactly.
And so that's one of the sort of unique things within the United Methodist Church, is this sort of really, really broad invitation for all to come forward. All you need to possess is the desire to know God's grace in your life. And so I think that that's an important aspect of justifying grace within our tradition, to say that we don't know how someone's going to come to that experience. So we need to be as hospitable as possible so that there may have that opportunity within the sort of bounds or structure of our ministries. That's sort of an emphasis on hospitality, because if we believe that you can have this moment of justification in a variety of ways and multiple times throughout your life, then we have a responsibility to help people have those experiences, or create the atmosphere where people feel, comfortable to come forward and have that moment with God, where we are aware of our shortcoming, failure, our need for forgiveness. And that is at the heart of what justification is. It's a recognition that we cannot save ourselves, regardless of if we're good. We cannot save ourselves. We need God to do that on our behalf. And thank God that God provides a way.
And God has already done it.
God has already done
it. That's the momentary
because the moment you recognize,
yeah.
right, like chopstick, the moment you recognize that you are in need of saving, you are already saved.
Yeah. And that, to me, that makes so much sense logically if we believe that Jesus's life, death, and resurrection has any power. Then we have to believe that that power is already there for us. And it's already done. And it's happened. And we then are invited to be aware of it and to respond to it.
Right.
And again, I love the emphasis on hospitality. I love emphasizing that because I think in some ways within the church, we think of hospitality as this like really passive thing where we're just like waiting for people to show up and then we smile at them as they walk by us like quickly, you know?
Yeah.
And
a spotted owl. Let's go look at it. You know, like you just kind of, I remember being a pastor at a church where we didn't have a lot of young people early on. And, you know, one young person walks in the door and they just get like descended upon, right?
Gosh,
and like a lot of handshaking and come on back and singing our choir kind of comments, you know?
But it seems passive, right? Because it's like we're just standing around waiting for
people to come in the door, but we're not doing much to invite them in.
Right, which we can talk about that later. But what I mean is that it seems like it's not very intentional. Like it's the lowest, easiest thing for volunteers to do, for example, in a church. Like you just open a door and you smile at someone. But there is something really meaningful about thinking of it as creating space for someone who might need to have a moment of justification, who might need to have a moment of grace. And so when we think about hospitality as a way of making room for somebody, making space for somebody.
I like using the notion of accessibility, right?
Yeah.
How can we make God's grace the most accessible?
Yeah.
And that sort of requires a whole lot of things.
Right.
It requires entrances that people can get up and down. It requires someone welcoming them and making them feel like they belong or that they're certainly welcomed in our space. It requires good coffee. Because the minute you drink bad coffee, you might be going to look for good coffee, right? It requires so many different things to be really hospitable. And we do it not to just grow our church or to get more young people in the door. We do it because we do not know who's going to enter into our space and truly need that moment of justification in their life. Yeah. Truly need that awareness that, you know, God has already done the work on their behalf and they are already loved, right?
You know, and I was thinking about this, like, obviously I don't believe that the church is the only place or the only space.
Of course not.
But I will say this, I think a lot of spaces in our world help people know how bad they are. They heap shame on people. There's a lot of ways, but I think it's harder to find those places in our world where we can be reminded that we're already good, where we can be reminded that as soon as you recognize your need for love and grace and salvation, that it's yours. And so that's where I think the church has a lot of hope and a lot of power to offer the world to combat the shame that we find so easily in all the places. Now, the church has also been part of heaping shame on people, right? So I'm not trying to excuse the church from that. And the church universal, a lot of churches still do this, and that's their like bread and butter. And they love heaping shame on people and then somehow making it seem like the only place to be justified is in their church. And
after they've shamed you.
Right. And after
come back we're going to tell you what's wrong with you, then you're going to come back and we'll fix you.
Yeah. And also thanks for giving us some money.
Right.
So there's a lot of churches that I think, you know, they try to ramp up the problem so that then they can be and offer the only solution. But I do think in general society, we're often told in work, in school, in so many places of our lives, we have to earn.
Yeah.
We have to earn things, and we are told often that we fail. And we think right? Think about, we earn grades, we earn promotions, we earn jobs, we earn salaries, we earn awards, we earn love. In many situations, we feel like we have to earn or prove our worthiness. And so
all the time.
And we're constantly falling short of that in society and like everyday life. And then we're told that at church as well. So I just think we all actually need to feel like we are made right. We all need to feel like we're loved for just as we are, that we belong.
Yeah.
And I think the church has this really powerful way of creating space for people to actually have that experience. Again, not the only place, but we offer that clear message of salvation.
It's a unique role the church plays in the world.
And can play in the world.
Can play.
Yeah. That we should try to play more.
We work at, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I'm totally with you. If the church has two things that it is uniquely qualified to do, is to create spaces of belonging, acceptance, love, and empowerment for individuals that have a hard time finding it, for all of us, because we have a hard time finding it elsewhere. And we're really good at intergenerational relationships, or have the ability to be really good. It's one of the only places in our society where we have this broad spectrum of people gathering every week. And that's why I think the baptismal covenant, that part of the worship service where we baptize infants, is a great sort of example of God's grace at work in a plethora of ways amongst a very diverse, congregation as it relates to age and life stage. And it's a really good reminder that this journey that we're on, like, there are people who've been on it before and can help us recognize our own need to like keep going, or to model it for our children, or to mentor or be mentored, or be in like relationships with folks who can help us see where the next steps are, where the pitfalls are, or how we're going to take that, that big step on our spiritual journey. And all of it is God's grace at work in our life. But the moment we're justified, it's like, that's not the end of the journey. In fact, you could say that that's just really the beginning, right?
Yeah.
The moment we are aware of our need for God's grace, we're set in right alignment on our life that is a Google Doc, right? And we're justified, is really where it starts, because then we have this grace. God's grace pushes us and refines us and helps us get actually better at being a faithful Christian.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But we still have the ability to say yes or say no to it.
We do.
We still have the ability to lean into it or lean away from it. And that goes back to like what you've said about community as well. And I do think that's really that's an important reminder that that we don't do any of this alone. That there is so much about God's grace and about God's love that we experience in community, which is why healthy community is so important.
No.
Because think of how much harm is done through the communities in the name of God. in the name of
love.
Yeah, in the name of love, in the name of grace, right? Like, so I
love the sinner, hate the sin, right?
Yep. It does a lot of harm. But okay, I want to tell a story. I didn't think I would tell this until we started talking, but it just reminded me of this so much. It's like a pastoral story. There was a moment where a friend of mine had really struggled with where things were in their life, and they were very disappointed with how things were turning out. And so they had a moment where they thought, well, maybe I should just end my life. Mm-hmm. And they ended up in the hospital. And I was called as a pastor. I just happened to know them more personally as a friend, but I was called as a pastor to go and visit with them. And I was really nervous. I was really worried and overwhelmed. And I felt this pressure of, what am I going to say? How am I going to respond to this person? And I went to our chapel and I started praying about this. And I just kept praying, God, please tell this person that you love them. Please tell them that you love them. Please, please, please help them know that you love them. Please tell them that you love them. And it wasn't like audible or anything, but the phrase popped into my head, I already have. And I had this vision or this like image of Jesus on the cross as I like heard that. Mm-hmm. And it was a moment where I realized again that we are so desperate to know that we're loved or saved or okay or forgiven or all these things. Mm-hmm. And God's like, I have already done that. Like, it's there. It's already there for you.
Yeah.
And I just remember, again, feeling like such relief in that moment for this person, but also for myself. A reminder that it's there. God's grace is there. If we believe anything that we proclaim about God's active love in the world and God's incarnation and presence in the person of Jesus, and then Jesus's life, including teaching and healing and work and death, but ultimately also the resurrection. It's not just death, but there's this moment of like, it's there for us. And so justification is powerful because it is a reminder and it's an assurance. And that's the other like kind of side bit of our experience of grace that Wesley always added, John Wesley always added in prevenient, justifying, and sanctifying grace, because next to justification was that moment, an experience of assurance. Yeah. So I just think
blessed assurance.
Yes. But how amazing if we could go around recognizing, oh my gosh, I messed up, and okay, I'm forgiven for that. So now I don't have to live in shame, but I can actually choose to be better the next time.
Yeah, and I think it's a powerful story and a powerful example of God's already done what we need God to do. It doesn't obviously absolve us from making things right, because while we seek forgiveness from God, we also might need to seek forgiveness from others. There may be more work to do, but we don't have to carry the sort of shame that makes that work really hard to do. Yeah. Where we sort of turn away from the work. Right,
exactly.
Because we either can't stand ourselves, or we can't figure out the right words, or we are nervous about making even a bigger mess, or so we go into avoidance mode, or we go into overprotective mode where we
defensive
can't recognize that it was partly or all our fault, right?
Yeah.
So the being forgiven bit is so that we can then seek and give forgiveness to others as well. And in that way, we are on this journey of getting better at this thing. And the more we come back to that chapel, right? The more we take that time to ask God to show up. If we can have those experiences that are really powerful, like the one you described, it may, hopefully we go back to the chapel more often.
Yeah.
Not less.
Right.
Not less. It's not one and done. It's not, oh, thank God I did that. It's, oh my gosh, I need that story. I need that promise that I am already loved and accepted and called to do really good work in the world.
Yeah.
How can I maintain that connection with God? Now, we can't live in the chapel. We can't live on our knees. We have to get up and work. But knowing that is sort of the foundation, that is a grounding for how we interact with God, ourselves, and others, like that is a really powerful example of having moments of justification throughout our journey, because we're going to need it.
And not being afraid to seek it.
Not being afraid to
And
seek
having the space.
it. Having the space, the awareness.
Yep.
Like, there's a part we play in this.
Yeah.
And sometimes
Absolutely.
God plays, kind of grabs our attention.
Absolutely.
But we have a role to play.
Yeah. And we have, we can trust, I think, that God's there and God's done the work. And so the role we have is to look for it and to recognize it and to listen for it. So, yeah.
Next episode is all about then, I guess.
What do we do with it?
What do we do with it?
Yeah,
And
once we see it.
How does
Yeah.
it show up in our life? And
Yeah.
I'm sure we'll talk about piety
Okay.
and
Sounds
holiness.
good. Yes, holiness. Oh,
Yeah.
Love it.
All right. Next episode.
All right.
I'm Reverend Mitchell Boone.
And I'm Reverend Elizabeth Moseley. And thanks for listening to Howdy, Theologian, a podcast for all who want to better understand the words we use and how they fit into a progressive theological context in today's world.
We're pastors at First United Methodist Church of Dallas, and you can find us worshiping in person or online on Sunday mornings. Follow our church on socials for more awesome content, and make sure to subscribe and share with your friends.